I didn't notice it at first. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't understand what I was noticing yet. That feels more honest. Because when I look back now, the change wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing about it looked like the kind of thing people usually point to when they say a relationship is falling apart. If anything, things looked stable, calm, predictable. And at the time, I thought that meant we were doing something right. I thought that meant we had moved past the uncertain stage. The stage where everything feels new and fragile. Where every small disagreement feels like it could become something bigger. Where you're constantly trying to figure out who the other person really is. When we first started dating, nothing about it felt predictable. And that's probably why I loved it. Not in a chaotic way, just alive. I remember the first few months very clearly. Not every detail, but the feeling of them. The sense that every conversation might go somewhere unexpected. That a simple dinner could turn into a 3-hour conversation. That a random walk could turn into a long night, sitting somewhere talking about things neither of us had planned to talk about. Back then, time moved strangely when we were together. Sometimes hours passed, and it felt like 30 minutes. Other times we would sit quietly for a while, and it still felt full. Not empty, just full of the sense that we were sharing something. I think that's the part people don't talk about enough. In the beginning of a relationship, you're not just learning facts about the other person. You're discovering how their mind moves. What they notice, what they think is funny, what they worry about, what makes them pause before answering a question. Those little pauses always fascinated me. She had this habit of thinking for a moment before answering certain questions. Not every question, just the ones that mattered a little more. I used to watch her face during those moments. The way her eyes shifted slightly as she thought. And when she finally answered, it usually felt like she had actually considered the question, not just reacted to it. That kind of attention felt rare. And I think that's what made those early conversations feel so meaningful. We weren't just talking. We were discovering each other. That discovery lasted a long time. Longer than I expected. Even after the first few months, things still felt open. Curious. We asked each other questions constantly. Small ones. Big ones. Sometimes random ones that had nothing to do with the moment we were in. Like one night, when we were driving back from dinner, and she suddenly asked, if you could go back and change one small moment in your life, not something big, just something tiny, would you? I remember laughing a little. Not because the question was funny, just because it came out of nowhere. And we spent the rest of the drive talking about small moments that might have changed things. Little decisions. Tiny forks in the road that seemed meaningless at the time. Conversations like that used to happen all the time. They felt natural. Like curiosity was the engine of the relationship. And that curiosity made everything feel alive. Even quiet moments. Even ordinary routines. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. And the strange part is that when it first happened, it didn't feel like a problem. It felt like maturity. That's the word I used in my head. Maturity. Because the relationship started to settle. Our schedules aligned. We developed routines. Dinner on certain nights. Groceries on weekends. Evenings on the couch watching something while half paying attention to our phones. And none of that felt bad. If anything, it felt comforting. I remember thinking at one point that we had reached the stage where things didn't need to be exciting all the time. Where stability was enough. Where the relationship could exist without constant discovery. And I believed that. For a while. But looking back now, I think what I was really watching was something else. Something quieter. Something harder to name. We were becoming predictable. Not in the healthy sense people talk about. Not in the way where you trust someone. I mean something slightly different. Our conversations started following the same paths. The same topics. Work. Plans. What to eat. Things that needed to be done that week. And slowly, without either of us noticing right away, the questions disappeared. Not completely, but gradually. We stopped asking the kinds of questions that open new doors. Instead, we asked questions that closed conversations. Did you finish that project? What time do you work tomorrow? Should we order food or cook? Practical questions. Necessary questions. But not curious ones. And curiosity, I'm realizing now, might be one of the most important parts of closeness. Without it, the relationship doesn't explode. It just flattens. At first I thought I was imagining it. I remember one night very clearly. We were sitting on the couch, the same place we had sat hundreds of times before. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. She was scrolling through her phone. I was looking at something on my laptop, and at some point I glanced over at her. Not because anything had happened, just instinctively, and I realized something strange. We hadn't spoken in almost 20 minutes. Not a single word. And the silence didn't feel tense. It just felt ordinary, like something we had both accepted without thinking about it. I remember closing the laptop and saying something random just to break the quiet. Something about a news story I had seen. She responded politely, nodded, said something brief. Then the conversation faded again. Not awkward, just predictable. And that's when the thought first appeared in my mind. Not fully formed, just a small observation. We don't surprise each other anymore. At the time I pushed that thought away. Because relationships change. Everyone says that. They settle. They stabilize. They stop being unpredictable. But over the next few months, I started noticing the pattern more clearly. Our days followed the same rhythm. Wake up, work, dinner, television, bed. Weekends had their own routine too. Groceries, maybe meeting friends, sometimes a movie. Nothing about it was unpleasant, but nothing about it felt new anymore either. And the strange thing is that the relationship still looked perfectly healthy from the outside. We didn't argue much. We supported each other. We still said we loved each other. But something underneath that structure had changed. It's difficult to explain, but the emotional texture of the relationship had flattened. Like music playing at a constant volume with no variation. Not loud, not quiet, just steady. I remember noticing it most during conversations. Or maybe I should say, during the lack of them. One evening we were eating dinner at the kitchen table. Pasta, wine, the same meal we had made together many times before. And halfway through the meal, I realized we had already talked about everything that usually filled our conversations. Work, schedules, weekend plans. And after that, nothing new appeared. The silence stretched for a while. She didn't seem uncomfortable. Neither was I. But I remember looking at her and thinking something strange. If we met today for the first time, would we still be curious about each other? That question stayed in my head long after dinner ended. Because curiosity had once been the most natural part of the relationship. And now it felt absent. Not deliberately, just quietly gone. That's when I started noticing how predictable everything had become. I could anticipate what she would say in certain conversations. She could probably anticipate my responses too. If I mentioned work stress, she would respond with a certain kind of reassurance. If she talked about a difficult situation with a friend, I would offer the same kind of advice I had given before. None of it was wrong. It was just familiar. Too familiar. Predictability can feel safe, but it can also slowly erase discovery. And discovery, I think, is what keeps two people feeling emotionally connected. Without it, the relationship becomes something else. Not broken, just known. Completely known. And once two people believe they already know everything about each other, they stop looking. They stop wondering. They stop asking. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It arrived slowly, like noticing the temperature of a room gradually dropping. One small observation at a time. A conversation that ended earlier than expected. A dinner where we ran out of things to say. An evening where we sat together but felt strangely separate. The most confusing part was that none of it felt dramatic enough to confront. There was no clear problem. Nothing you could point to and say, this is what's wrong. It was just the quiet disappearance of curiosity. And curiosity is subtle. You don't notice its absence right away. You only notice that something feels flatter than before. Eventually, there was one moment that made the realization impossible to ignore. It happened during a walk. We used to walk a lot together. At the beginning of the relationship, those walks felt endless. Conversations carried us through entire neighborhoods without either of us noticing how far we had gone. But that evening was different. We walked through the same park we had visited many times before. The air was cool. The sky was already dark. And we talked a little, mostly about small things. A coworker. A show we had watched recently. Nothing wrong with the conversation. But at some point it ended. Completely. And we kept walking. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. Neither of us spoke. We were just moving along the path. And suddenly I had this strange feeling. Not loneliness. Not sadness exactly. Just a quiet awareness. We know each other too well to be curious anymore. That thought stayed with me the rest of the night. Because curiosity used to be the thing that connected us. Without it, the relationship still functioned. But it no longer expanded. It just repeated. Days repeating. Conversations repeating. Reassurances repeating. And somewhere inside that repetition, something essential had faded. We were still close in many ways. But emotionally, we had stopped discovering each other. And discovery, I'm realizing now, is what keeps love feeling alive. When discovery stops, the relationship doesn't necessarily end. It just becomes predictable. And predictability can feel peaceful for a while. But eventually it starts to feel like something else. Like watching a story you already know the ending to. You still care about the characters. You still appreciate the moments. But the sense of wonder is gone. And once wonder disappears, it's hard to pretend you don't notice the difference. I don't remember the exact moment I understood that we had become predictable. Not the first moment I thought about it, but the moment it settled into something I couldn't ignore anymore. It happened quietly, like most of the changes in that relationship. No argument, no dramatic realization, just one small observation that felt heavier than the others. We were sitting at the kitchen table again. It was late. The overhead light was off, and the only thing lighting the room was a small lamp near the counter. That kind of soft light always made the apartment feel calmer, more intimate. She was telling me about something that happened at work that day. A misunderstanding between two people on her team. Nothing serious. Just the kind of thing people talk about when they're replaying their day out loud. I listened, nodded, asked a question or two. But somewhere in the middle of her story, I noticed something strange. Not about her. About myself. I already knew what she was going to say next. Not exactly word for word, but the shape of it, the tone, the conclusion she would arrive at. And when she finished the story, it unfolded almost exactly the way I expected. She paused, took a sip of her tea, looked at me like she was waiting for a response. And I said something supportive, something kind, something I had probably said before in a slightly different situation. She smiled a little, the kind of smile that says the response was appropriate. Then the conversation ended. Not awkwardly, just naturally. And as the quiet settled in again, that thought returned. I can predict almost everything now. At first I tried to interpret that thought as something positive. Predictability means stability, right? It means comfort, trust, understanding. Those are things people want in relationships. But the longer I sat there thinking about it, the more something about it felt off. Because what I was feeling didn't quite resemble comfort. It felt more like completion. Like the relationship had already revealed everything it was going to reveal. Like we had finished discovering each other. And now we were just repeating the parts we already knew. That realization stayed with me for weeks. Not loudly, just sitting somewhere in the back of my mind. And once you start noticing a pattern like that, you begin to see it everywhere. I noticed it in our routines. The way our evenings unfolded almost the same way every day. Dinner, conversation about work, a show, phones, bed. None of it was unpleasant. But none of it surprised me anymore either. I noticed it in the way we responded to each other's moods. If she was quiet, I knew she was stressed about work. If I was distracted, she knew I was thinking about something related to my job. We had become good at reading each other, but we had stopped exploring each other. And that difference is subtle, but it matters. Reading someone is about recognition. Exploring someone is about curiosity. Recognition is stable. Curiosity is alive. Somewhere along the way, our relationship had moved entirely into recognition, and curiosity had quietly disappeared. I think the hardest part about realizing that was understanding that neither of us had done anything wrong. There was no betrayal, no moment of neglect, no argument that pushed us apart. We had simply settled, and settling had slowly replaced discovery. There was one evening that made that truth feel impossible to ignore. We were sitting on the couch again. The same couch where we had spent hundreds of evenings together. A movie was playing. Neither of us was really paying attention to it. She was scrolling through something on her phone. I was half watching the screen, half thinking about something else. At one point she laughed quietly at something she read. Not a big laugh, just a small breath of amusement. In the early days of the relationship, that kind of moment always led to something. She would show me the screen. We would talk about whatever she was reading. Sometimes it would lead to a completely different conversation. But that night, she didn't show me. And I didn't ask. Not because I didn't care. Because I already assumed it wouldn't lead anywhere new. That moment passed. And the quiet returned. And that's when the realization settled in fully. Not dramatically. Just calmly. We had stopped surprising each other. And without surprise, curiosity fades. And without curiosity, something essential about love begins to flatten. It doesn't disappear completely. It just changes shape. The relationship becomes something more predictable, more manageable, more stable, but also less alive. That doesn't mean it's unhappy. That's the confusing part. From the outside, Everything still looked fine. We still cared about each other, still shared our lives, still functioned as a couple. But inside the relationship, the emotional movement had slowed, almost to a stop, and I began to wonder something I had never considered before. Maybe love doesn't fade only because people stop caring. Maybe sometimes it fades because two people stop discovering each other, because they believe they already know everything. And once that belief settles in, the relationship stops expanding. It just repeats. I don't know if she noticed it the same way I did. Maybe she did. Maybe she felt the same quiet shift. But we never talked about it directly. Not once. We talked about work, friends, plans, all the practical parts of life. But we never talked about the thing that had quietly changed between us. Maybe because it was hard to explain. How do you tell someone? I think we already know each other too well. Without it sounding like a complaint, it wasn't a complaint. It was just an observation. A quiet one. But the more I thought about it, the more it made me realize something important. Love doesn't only live in comfort. It also lives in curiosity, in questions, in the willingness to keep discovering the person sitting across from you. When that discovery stops, the relationship doesn't necessarily end, but it becomes something else, something predictable. And sometimes, predictability is the first sign that the story has already reached its quiet conclusion. Even if neither person has admitted it yet, I still think about that sometimes, about how slowly it happened, how gently. There was never a moment where everything broke. No single event that changed the direction of the relationship. It was more like watching a long road slowly straighten out. At the beginning, there were turns everywhere. Unexpected conversations, little discoveries, moments where one of us would say something that surprised the other. But by the end, the road had become completely straight. You could see everything ahead of you. Nothing hidden, nothing waiting around the corner. And maybe that kind of clarity feels safe. But it also means the sense of exploration is gone. And without exploration, love starts to feel less like a journey, more like a place you've already finished walking through. I'm not sure exactly when I accepted that. Not the moment the relationship ended. Just the moment I realized something essential had already changed. It probably happened during one of those quiet evenings. The kind where nothing unusual occurs. Where the conversation moves through familiar topics. Where the silence feels normal. And in the middle of that silence, you suddenly understand something you hadn't wanted to admit before. We're not discovering each other anymore. We're just remembering what we already know. And remembering isn't the same thing. It's calmer, but it's also still. And when love becomes completely still, something about it quietly begins to fade. Not because anyone failed. Not because anyone stopped caring. Just because curiosity slowly left the room. And neither of us noticed it leaving until the quiet felt a little too familiar. Now, when I think about that relationship, I don't remember dramatic moments. I remember patterns. The rhythm of our days. The predictability of our conversations. The comfort that slowly replaced discovery. And sometimes I wonder if that's something many people experience without talking about it. How two people can still love each other, still care deeply, still share a life together, and yet slowly watch the relationship become something entirely predictable, not broken, just finished discovering itself. And once a relationship reaches that point, I'm not sure what's supposed to happen next. Maybe some people find new ways to rediscover each other. Maybe curiosity can return. Or maybe sometimes the quiet truth is simply this. We watched the relationship become predictable, and neither of us knew how to make it mysterious again. And maybe that's where the story quietly ended. Not with a fight, not with a goodbye, just with the slow realization that we had already learned everything about each other that we were going to learn. And the rest was repetition. And repetition can be peaceful for a while, but it can also feel like something slowly closing. Even when neither person says a word about it. I didn't realize how much I had started observing the relationship instead of living inside it. That shift happened so quietly that I didn't notice it right away. But once it did happen, it was impossible to unnotice. Instead of just being with her, I began paying attention to the patterns between us. The pauses in conversations. The way certain evenings unfolded almost exactly like the evenings before them. The way we could move through an entire night together without anything unexpected happening. At first, I thought that was simply what long relationships looked like. Maybe everyone eventually reaches a point where things feel familiar, where you stop discovering new layers of the other person, where the relationship settles into something stable. But the more I thought about it, the more something about that explanation didn't feel completely true. Because familiarity alone wasn't the issue. It was the absence of curiosity. That's what had changed. Curiosity used to exist in almost everything we did together, not just in big conversations, even in small moments. I remember one night during the early months when we were sitting on her balcony after dinner. The city was quiet, just a few distant sounds of traffic and people talking somewhere down the street. She asked me something simple. What were you like as a kid? It wasn't an unusual question. People asked that all the time. But the way she asked it felt different. Like she genuinely wanted to understand something about me that wasn't obvious. So I told her a story about being quiet in school. About the way I used to spend hours building things or reading instead of talking much. And after I finished the story, she asked another question. And then another. Not rapid questions. Just slow ones. Thoughtful ones. Questions that made the conversation open wider instead of closing it. That kind of curiosity created depth. It made each conversation feel like a small exploration. But by the time the relationship reached its later stage, those kinds of questions had disappeared. Not intentionally. We just stopped asking them. Instead, we talked about the surface of things. The daily structure of life. Tasks. Schedules. Responsibilities. And again, none of that felt wrong. It just felt predictable. Sometimes I would catch myself waiting for something unexpected to appear in a conversation. A question that opened a new direction. A comment that revealed something unfamiliar about her. But those moments became rare. Not non-existent. Just rare enough that I started noticing their absence. And once you start noticing the absence of curiosity, you realize how important it was all along. Without curiosity, conversations become informational, not exploratory. You exchange updates instead of discovering thoughts. And that shift changes the emotional texture of the relationship in ways that are difficult to explain. One evening stands out clearly in my memory. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did. We were sitting at the kitchen table again. The same small lamp lighting the room. The same quiet background noise from the city outside. She was telling me about something that happened during her day. A coworker had misunderstood something she said in a meeting. She explained the situation calmly, almost casually. I listened and nodded, asked a question about it. She answered, and then the conversation ended. Just like that. I remember looking down at the table after she finished speaking and thinking something strange. There was nothing left to explore. Not because the story wasn't interesting, but because both of us already knew exactly how the conversation was supposed to go. The reactions, the advice, the reassurance. Everything had become familiar. Too familiar. At that moment, I realized something that made me slightly uncomfortable. I had started predicting the emotional flow of our conversations. I knew when she would pause, when she would shrug something off, when she would say, "It's not a big deal." And I realized she probably knew the same things about me. Predictability isn't necessarily bad, but it changes the feeling of interaction. Instead of two people discovering each other, it becomes two people confirming what they already know. And confirmation is quiet. It doesn't expand. It just repeats. That's when I started noticing the difference between comfort and stagnation. Comfort feels safe. Stagnation feels still. And the relationship had slowly moved into stillness. At first, that stillness felt peaceful. But over time, it began to feel flat, like a surface without depth. I think the hardest part about recognizing that was understanding that neither of us had caused it deliberately. There was no moment where one of us stopped trying. No point where someone decided the relationship wasn't important anymore. We had simply grown used to each other. And that familiarity slowly replaced curiosity. Maybe that happens naturally in many relationships. Maybe it's unavoidable. I'm not sure. But I remember the exact moment when the realization settled fully into my mind. It happened during another quiet evening on the couch. The television was on again. She was scrolling through something on her phone. I was leaning back with my eyes half on the screen. And suddenly I noticed something about the room. It felt complete. Not in a good way. Just complete. Like everything about our interaction had already been written. Every conversation. Every routine. Every reaction. Nothing about the evening held the possibility of surprise. And in that moment, I understood something simple but difficult. We had reached the point where we knew each other completely. And knowing someone completely can feel beautiful. But it can also feel like the end of discovery. And discovery might be one of the quiet engines of love. Without it, the relationship doesn't necessarily break. It just stops moving. Like a river that slowly becomes a still lake. Peaceful. but motionless. After that realization, I began noticing the relationship from a slightly different perspective. Not critically, just attentively. I paid attention to the rhythm of our days, the predictability of our routines, the way our conversations moved along familiar paths. And I started wondering something that felt difficult to admit. If love needs curiosity to stay alive, what happens when curiosity disappears? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But I do remember how the relationship felt during those final months. Not unhappy, not broken, just finished discovering itself. And that feeling is subtle. It's not the kind of thing you wake up one morning and suddenly realize. It's something you notice slowly, through patterns, through quiet moments, through the strange sense that nothing new is appearing between you anymore. Eventually, there was a night when we went for another walk through the park near her apartment. The same path we had walked many times before. The air felt cool again. The streetlights cast long shadows across the ground. We talked a little about ordinary things. A new restaurant that opened nearby, a friend who had recently moved. Then the conversation ended, and we walked the rest of the path in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, just quiet. At one point I glanced at her. She looked peaceful, thoughtful, and I remember realizing something in that moment. We weren't discovering each other anymore. We were simply sharing space. Two people walking the same path, not asking new questions, not exploring new thoughts, just moving forward quietly. And I think that's when the relationship changed for me. Not emotionally, but intellectually. I understood something about it that I hadn't understood before. We had become predictable, and predictability, for a while, had felt like stability. But eventually it started to feel like something else. Like the quiet end of exploration. I didn't know what to do with that understanding. I never confronted her about it. Never asked if she felt the same shift. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. But by the time I realized what had happened, the relationship had already become something calm, something familiar, something complete. And sometimes, late at night now, when everything around me is quiet again, I still think about that stage of the relationship. Not with regret, just curiosity. About how two people can care about each other deeply, and still slowly watch the mystery between them disappear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. One predictable evening at a time. Until the relationship stops feeling like a journey, and starts feeling like a place you've already explored completely. And once you realize that, you sit there for a moment, thinking about everything that once felt new, and everything that now feels familiar, and you understand something simple. We didn't fall out of love in a dramatic way. We just watched the relationship become predictable, and somewhere inside that predictability, the sense of discovery quietly faded away. And once discovery disappears, it's difficult to remember what it felt like when everything between you still held the possibility of surprise. After a while, I stopped trying to measure the relationship by moments. At the beginning, moments were everything. A long conversation at midnight, a random question during a drive, a small confession that came out of nowhere and changed the tone of the evening. Back then, every day seemed capable of becoming something unexpected. But later, I noticed that I couldn't point to moments like that anymore. Not because our days were empty. They weren't. They were full of normal life. Work, dinner, conversations about plans, conversations about responsibilities. But the emotional texture of those days had flattened. If someone asked me what a typical evening with her looked like during that last year, I could describe it almost perfectly. Not because I remembered specific evenings, because they were all nearly identical. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me thoughtful. Because predictability isn't necessarily bad. People spend years searching for stability in relationships. But stability can slowly transform into something quieter than people expect. It can become repetition. And repetition has a strange emotional effect. It removes uncertainty, but it also removes discovery. And without discovery, time starts to feel different. I remember one Saturday afternoon when we were cleaning the apartment together. She was in the kitchen wiping down the counters. I was in the living room picking up a few things from the floor. We moved around each other naturally, almost automatically. At one point she asked if I could grab something from the cabinet. I did. Then she asked if I could open a window because it was getting warm. I did that too. Everything about the interaction felt smooth, easy, like we had practiced living together long enough that our movements no longer needed explanation. But as I stood there near the window, I suddenly had a strange thought. We've become really good at this. Not this in the emotional sense. This, in the mechanical sense. Living together. Coexisting. Managing daily life. We had become efficient partners. Efficient. That word stayed with me. Because efficiency is useful, but it's not the same thing as emotional depth. Efficiency makes things work. Depth makes things feel alive. And somewhere in the process of becoming efficient, something softer had faded. Later that evening, we went out to dinner. A small restaurant we liked. Not fancy, just comfortable. The kind of place where the staff recognizes you after a while. We sat at the same table near the window. Ordered similar things we usually ordered. The waiter even joked about how predictable we had become with our choices. We laughed, because it was true. But that word again, predictable. Predictable dinners. Predictable conversations. Predictable evenings. And again, none of it felt wrong. But it did make me aware of something subtle. Predictability had quietly replaced curiosity. When curiosity existed, the relationship felt open. Possibilities everywhere. When predictability took over, the possibilities seemed to narrow. I remember looking across the table at her that night. She looked calm, comfortable. There was nothing about her expression that suggested unhappiness. And that's what made the situation difficult to interpret. Because the relationship wasn't broken. There were no obvious problems. No betrayals. No resentments. Just a slow transformation. Love had gradually turned into something quieter. Something structured. Something known. After dinner, we walked home through the same streets we always used. The air was cool again. She told me about something a friend had said earlier that week. I listened. Responded. But halfway through the conversation, I noticed something familiar. The pattern. Her tone. The way the story would end. Not because she was boring. Just because I knew her well enough now that very little surprised me anymore. And I realized something in that moment. Knowing someone deeply can create two very different feelings. One is intimacy. The other is predictability. Intimacy still leaves room for discovery. Predictability quietly removes it. The difference between those two things is subtle, but it matters more than people realize. When discovery disappears, the relationship begins to feel finished in a strange way. Not finished in the sense that it ends. Finished in the sense that everything inside it has already been explored. And once you believe that, the emotional energy changes. You stop asking questions. You stop wondering. You stop searching for new layers. Not intentionally. It just happens. Eventually, I noticed something about myself that made this realization even clearer. When something interesting happened during my day, I no longer felt the same urgency to tell her about it. Not because I didn't care about sharing. Because I already knew how the conversation would go. She would listen, respond kindly, offer a thought. Then the moment would settle into the familiar rhythm we always had. And suddenly the impulse to share something new didn't feel as strong. That's when I understood something important. Curiosity doesn't just depend on asking questions. It depends on believing the other person might still surprise you. Once you stop expecting surprise, curiosity fades. And when curiosity fades, so does the sense of discovery. The strange thing is that none of this made me feel dramatic emotions. No heartbreak. No panic. Just a quiet awareness. Like slowly realizing that a chapter of a book is coming to an end even though you're still reading the last few pages. You're still there. Still part of the story. But something about the direction of it has already settled. One night we were lying in bed with the lights off. The room was completely dark except for a little light coming through the window from the street outside. She was already half asleep. I could hear her breathing slowly beside me. And I remember staring at the ceiling thinking something simple. I think we already know everything about each other. Not literally everything, but everything that creates emotional mystery. Everything that sparks curiosity. And once that realization settles into your mind, it's hard to ignore. Because mystery is part of what makes connection feel alive. Not the mystery of secrets. The mystery of discovery. Of realizing there are still parts of the other person you haven't explored yet. That mystery had slowly disappeared between us. Not because we did anything wrong. Because time revealed everything. And once everything is revealed, something changes. I'm not saying love disappears at that point. But it transforms. It becomes something calmer. More structured. Less curious. Maybe some people are comfortable living inside that version of love. Maybe some couples find ways to create new discovery even after years together. But at that moment, lying there in the quiet, I understood something about us. We had reached the stage where nothing about the relationship surprised us anymore. And once surprise disappears, curiosity follows. And once curiosity fades, The emotional movement inside the relationship slows down. Eventually, almost completely. The next morning we woke up, made coffee, talked about what we needed to do that day. Everything unfolded exactly the way it always did. And as I watched the routine begin again, I realized something that felt both peaceful and sad at the same time. We hadn't ruined anything. We hadn't failed each other. We had simply finished discovering the relationship. And once a story reaches that point, it becomes quiet, predictable, almost complete. And the strange thing is, nobody tells you exactly what you're supposed to do when love becomes that calm, when everything works. But nothing surprises you anymore. So you keep moving through the routine, keep sharing space, keep caring about each other. And sometimes you sit there quietly, wondering if this is what love eventually becomes. Not broken, not gone, just completely known. And once something becomes completely known, there are fewer questions left to ask.